Shalom. I want to talk to you about Miketz, which is the 10th parsha of our book of Genesis, or Bereshit. And in doing so, I'm going to bring in other sources. But I want us to understand some of those sources. First off, I want to talk to you a little bit about the Sefer Yetzirah, which Sefer is obviously book, Yetzirah is formation. So this is the book of formation, or the book about creation. And so in our story, this book was supposedly written, it wasn't written, it was told by Abraham in the beginning, and then it later became published. But it wasn't published until into a book form until probably about the 6th century. And then it began people added to it as it went along, filling in the details that had been learned as they go. But anyway, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the coding in the story that we're going to do today. And we also want to talk about, at the same point in time, in this coding, there's what we call a gematria, an understanding of numbers and how they fit to our story. In a book called the Humash, which I have here from an art scroll, which is basically the Torah section and then notes given to it. Well, at the end of the Torah section, these are the notes that I found fascinating. It says this Masoric note means there are 146 verses in this whole Sidra. Numerically, that corresponds to a mnemonics of Hezekiah and Amaziah. And it also, when you break it down into the numbers, because the value of the name of Hezekiah and the value of the name of Amaziah is 146. But there's also a phrase at the end of this book that's in chapter 44 and verse 17, where it begins by saying, "But he replied, it would be sacrilegious for me to do this. Well, the man in whose possession the goblet was found, only he shall be my slave." Now, the value of the phrase, "he shall be my slave," is 146. So our story then begins to look at things that are alike. One of the things that early scholars, early studiers of Torah, were mathematicians. And we know that Hebrew is both mathematical as well as literal or lingual. And so what they've done is, as they're going through, they parse out the math of the problems and use those to help them understand other things. Now there's this idea of multiple ways to read any text. In fact, Rabbi Avraham Trugman has a book out. It's called The 70 Faces, talking about the multiple ways that a rabbi or a scholar can look at the text and come up with understandings that are deeper and more broad than just simply the literal learning of the text. So we're going to learn the text, but I want to broaden it out, and I want to add to the text by going into these other faces and showing you some of them. So anyway, that is what I want to begin with. But I'm not done there, because it says besides the names of Hezekiah and Amaziah, there's also another mnemonics. The same value, the same number of verses are found in Genesis, the first section, Bereshit, 146 verses. Now those 146 verses then, we're now going to intermingle or collate these two stories together. So we're going to talk about not only this parsha, but we're also going to bring in some of the stories out of Bereshit. And by that I mean to say, let me give you an example. First off, the word Miketz. Well, ketz means the end. So here's the end, and Bereshit is the beginning. So we begin to see a weaving between the two. In Sefer Yetzirah, they talk about the 10th is woven into the first, meaning that this 10th chapter finds meaning in the first chapter and in the creation stories, understanding, because Joseph is going to, in essence, create a situation. Well, actually, God created the situation, but he is going to be there to interpret it. Also, we're going to understand, if you go back to, well, why don't we do that? Let's go back to the first chapter of the book of Genesis for a second. And I want you to look at that first verse. Now, in looking at the first verse, I don't want you to look at it in the English side. I want you to look at the Hebrew side. In the Hebrew side is Bereshit bara Elohim et Hashemayim va'etz Hashman Hasaretz. Easy for you to say. Now, the concept that I wanted you to understand is the fact that our story begins by talking about in the beginning of creation, there was Elohim. Now, we're introduced in the beginning to the character called Elohim. In the book of Miketz, that is the only character we're going to find is the Elohim. Elohim will finish out the rest of the book of Genesis. So we begin with Elohim, we end with Elohim. His story becomes the prominent story and what we're going to understand. So Bereshit will proclaim that God is all powerful. Pharaoh will also claim to be all powerful. But in the end, the claims of Pharaoh change, and he begins to understand that it's God who is all powerful. And so we'll begin to look at some of those things that are going on. Now, the Talmud indicates that Joseph is going to be released from prison as our 41st chapter begins. He's going to be released from prison. In fact, why don't you go to chapter 41 and go to verse 1. Here it says, it happened at the end of 2 years to the day. Well, what happened at the end of 2 years to the day? At that point, Pharaoh was dreaming that, behold, he was standing over the river. So in other words, at the end of these 2 years, Pharaoh's dream is going to be revealed. Now, why is he talking about it for 2 years? Because 2 years prior, on the very same day, Joseph had given a understanding to a baker and to a cup maker or a cup holder, and told them the meaning of their dreams. To one, he said, you would last 3 days and then you'll be hung. That was to the baker. He said to the cup maker, in 3 days, you'll be released from prison. And that occurs on Rosh Hashanah. The day that this occurs, according to the Talmud, is Rosh Hashanah. So it's 2 years between the revealing of one and its actual acting out and the revealing of the next one. Now, in this whole process, then, what we're looking at is a story that has significance in terms of the beginning. Rosh Hashanah, remember, is the day in which God created man. It's the day in which we begin the new year. It's the day of the beginning of judgment. For the next 10 days, remember, this is the process of going through and clarifying yourself and cleansing yourself and putting yourself into a better position. This is regarding the judgment that God will be giving you for the next year. And so as our story begins, we're dealing with that very day. Who is the character who's being looked at during that day? Elohim. So we're watching our story unfold before us. And so in this story, then, what I want you to begin to understand is Pharaoh is having a dream, but it's not the first time he's had it. He's been having it over a period of time. The only difference is he cannot remember it in the morning, or can't remember it for any length of time. But as the closer to these 2 years comes, the closer it is to the fact that he now begins to remember coherently the parts to the dream. Now, 2 years also tells us that that's a time that Joseph was being punished. Why was Joseph being punished? Well, if we go back to understand, he interpreted the 2 dreams, gave God the credit, but when it came to asking for assistance, make sure you talk to Pharaoh about what I did for you. In other words, he was no longer trusting in God, who helped him understand the dreams. He was now putting the trust into the butler. And for 2 years, the butler never did anything with the information. So overall, Joseph has spent about 12 years in jail at this point in time, in prison. And so now we're reaching the end of that point in time. Now, if we look at the first line, we notice right off, Pharaoh was dreaming, and behold, he was standing over or above the Nile River. The river is the Nile River. Now, understand in the Egyptian culture, the Nile River is a god. And when Pharaoh says he was standing over the Nile, indicates that he was the god above the Nile River. In other words, he was superior to the Nile River. And so that's what he began. That's where our story will actually begin, with him beginning to go through these dreams. Now, as it goes on in verse 2, it says, when behold, out of the river there emerged 7 cows of beautiful appearance and robust flesh, and they were grazing in the marshlands. Then behold, 7 other cows emerged after them out of the river, of ugly appearance and gaunt flesh, and they stood next to the cows on the bank of the river. Now the cows of ugly appearance and gaunt flesh ate the 7 cows of beautiful appearance and robust, and the Pharaoh awoke. So notice we have the cows. They recognize that there is beauty in the first 7. They are elegant. They're standing there. They're eating grass. Then all of a sudden, 7 gaunt cows come out of the water, and now they're standing with them, and soon they will inherit them, or they will envelop them at that point. And at that point, on this particular dream, that Pharaoh wakes up. Now he continues to go on. It says in verse 5, and so he fell asleep again, and he dreamed a second time. Now, this second dream is what we're going to. This is the dream that it says there were 7 ears of, 7 ears, 7 ears of grain were sprouting on a single stalk. Now, up north in Indiana, farm country, if you can get 2 ears of corn off of a stalk, you're doing well. But to have 7 ears off of any granary product, you're doing extremely well. So these plants were producing far more than they were ever needing to or could. And so, but they were good and healthy. Now the 7 ears thin and scorched by the east wind, which is the wind that's identified as with the foreboding wind, were growing after them. Then the thin ears swallowed up the healthy and full ears. Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it had been a dream. So both of these are dreams that he's experiencing. Now, you and I, when we go to sleep, we go into what's called a period of time in which we literally, according to the Jew, our soul tries to leave our body, and we reach a point called 1/60th of death. So the idea of what's going on in our dream is that our body becomes detached in a sense. I know you and I have dreamed dreams. Some of you don't remember any of your dreams, but when you do, they're usually pretty ludicrous. And that's because half of your brain is not functioning in this thing. Your rational side does not get involved in the dreams. The rational side is just closed. And so you have these fantastic ideas and things that happen that are beyond the normal. Well, here's one where it's a beyond normal, but at the same time, it has some of the characteristics that you could normally imagine as a farmer. You can imagine 7 good-looking cows. You can't imagine 7 scrawny ones coming up and devouring them, and when they finish devouring them, they're still scrawny. So you have a little bit of a difference, and the same thing with the ears and the grain. The Salomer, when he was talking about this, he says, we can definitely talk about this in terms of a dream that is prophetic, but it's also a dream that speaks to our inclinations. All of us have what we would call good inclinations, things that we do well, that we enjoy doing and we do for God. But we also have those things that get in our way, those interferences, those things that we do that we wish we hadn't done, And those are the evil inclinations. And so the rabbi said, think about this for a while. If you were looking at the inclination itself, understand that you and I do good things and we do things that are not so good. And the question is, where does our focus go? And he goes through the parsha that way. I'm not going to go there, but I wanted to give you a head start in case you wanted to start thinking about it. So Pharaoh now has gone through his dreams, and he now finds himself with a problem. In verse 8, it says, and it was in the morning, his spirit was agitated, so that he sent and summoned all of the necromancers, all of the diviners, all of those people who help him understand prophetic mysteries, or whatever you want to call it. And so he's calling them all together, all of its wise men. And Pharaoh related to them his dream, but none could interpret them for Pharaoh. Now, that doesn't mean that they couldn't give him a possibility. He was not satisfied with any of their understandings. Some of them came to the conclusion that the 7 good cows were 7 girls that would be born into his house, and the 7 gaunt ones would be the fact that the 7 girls died, and the same thing with the grain. So he has an understanding, but it doesn't fit with what he thinks he's seeing, and so he rejects all of them. So in verse 9, we begin to see a change, because that's when the chamberlain of the cupbearers spoke up before Pharaoh. My transgressions do I mention today? In other words, I've done some things wrong, and I want to bring them up, because for Pharaoh had become incensed at his servants and had placed me in the ward of the house of the chamberlain of the butchers. Now, the chambers of the butchers is not, Pharaoh was not a meat eater. He was a vegetarian. The chamber of the butchers was the chamber of the death. That's where people went and they were executed from there. And the butcher was the executioner. So that's where Joseph had been staying. That's where Pharaoh, or the cupbearer, had been. That's where the baker had been. So he was talking to him about what was going on in those places. And it said, we dreamt a dream on the same night. I and he, each one according to the interpretation of his dream, did we dream. And there with us was a Hebrew youth, a slave of the chamberlain of the butchers. So if we want, we can now identify what was the occupation of Potiphar. Potiphar worked for him as the head of a prison. He was also in charge of executions. So that's what Potiphar's idea of an occupation was. But anyway, so he begins to go through the story with us. And he says at this particular point in our story, he interpreted our dreams for us. He interpreted for each in accordance with his dream. So in other words, one size does not fit all. He made it fit to the situation. And it was that just as he interpreted it for us, so did it happen. Me, he restored to my post, and him, he had hanged. So Pharaoh now hears a story of a boy, a slave, and notice the words that are used. It's a Hebrew youth, a slave. In Pharaoh's court, in Pharaoh's Egypt, Hebrews, Jews, were not a good thing. They were less than to be desired. And so a slave would be a good way of putting it. That's the best occupation for these people. And so as he's giving this understanding, he puts it or parses it in such a way that he gets across the idea that this is not, yeah, he knows how to interpret dreams, but you're going to have to understand he doesn't act like you or I. He's not in the same category as we are. So anyway, he goes through this whole idea. And so in our story then, he wanted to know, or he gave him Joseph's name. Now there's a problem with coming before the Pharaoh. That problem is the fact that as a royal, a Jew should not enter into the royal palace. And here they were about to bring him in. Joseph had to be changed, completely changed. Joseph also had to learn something overnight. You see, one of the things that he had to know to enter into the palace to stand before the Pharaoh was he had to be able to speak 70 languages. He had to be articulate. How does a boy who's just spent the last 12 years in jail, and before that had lived with his father and not spent much time in the world, how is he going to learn 70 languages overnight? Which brings us to another understanding in Hebrew. There's such a thing as the midrash, or stories. The Arizal, when he was given this understanding, that the story had been out that there was an angel that came and gave to Joseph the ability to speak and understand in 70 languages. And actually, he understood in 71, which was more than Pharaoh would be able to, because Pharaoh doesn't know Hebrew. And so when Joseph stands before Pharaoh, he does not speak in Hebrew, but he speaks in Egyptian. And so we have an entirely different understanding of what's going on. Well, how did he gain 70 languages overnight? The Arizal says that at that point in time, a spirit entered into Joseph. The spirit that entered into Joseph was the spirit of Enoch of Genesis chapter 5, the one who had been taken up that never died. He, while after leaving, according to another Midrashic writings, became head of the angels for God, and his name was changed to Metatron. But in his return, he returned and entered into Joseph, and he participated with Joseph in all the things that were going on. And so Joseph now had more abilities besides languages than he had even before. He was an impeccable scholar. So Joseph now is in a situation where he is overnight cleaned up, shaven, put into royal-like robes, not royal robe, but royal-like robes, given the understanding of the languages, was now allowed to enter in before Pharaoh. And so now we begin the conversations in the palace themselves. But up until this point, we are just outside the palace. So again, Joseph is going to be listening to the dreams that are going on. And I want you to look at verse 17, if you will. Now it says, well, actually, we should see 16, because that's going to become important. Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, these are the two dreams that he had. Well, maybe we should go back further. Let's go to 14. So Pharaoh sent and summoned Joseph, and they rushed him from the dungeon. He shaved, he changed his clothes, he came to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I dreamt a dream, but no one can interpret it. Now I heard it said that you can comprehend a dream to interpret it. And so Joseph said, that is beyond me. It is God, and here Elohim, it is God who will respond with Pharaoh's welfare. So Joseph never takes credit for any of his dreams. The dreams come from God. But I want you to understand the maturity that Joseph has reached at this point in time. Because remember, Joseph had two dreams himself. Those two dreams occurred in the previous Parsha. And in those two dreams, you remember, he found himself in a field and he was bundling the grain. And he found, as he bundled the grain, that the grain of his brothers bowed to him. And so he, not in a haughty way maybe, but in certainly a braggadocious way, he said, look at me. You know, remember, the eventual result of this is the fact that the brothers will hate him even more. Because you see, he's been a tattletale. He's a mama's boy. Not only that, he's got the special robe. Everything is going his way. Well, he's not finished, because he has a second dream. And this one's even in a higher form, because now he finds himself with the sun, moon, and stars, or the constellations. And he finds himself standing there in this circle of, and the mother, the sun, the moon, and the rest of the constellations bow to him. And so at this point in time, Jacob puts a quash to it and says, stop. But the dream has already come out. There's no question what he meant by the dream. They all understand it. But let's go now and look at both dreams side by side for a second. In the case of Joseph's dreams, Joseph was actively involved. In other words, he was working with the straw. He was a part of the stars. In Pharaoh's dream, the cows and the grain were not him participating, but he was above them. He could see what was going on, but he was not participating in what was going on. So there's a difference in the way these dreams go. I also want you to understand that the dreams that we're talking about creates for us a need to know about dreams, how they work, what goes on in a dream. And the word that for dream in Hebrew is the word halom. It's het, lamed, vav, mem. So halom is our word that we're going to be looking for or working with. Now in Hebrew, again, we have building blocks, times when letters are used in fact, everything is created with language anyway. God spoke and it was. So language has always been the characteristic by which things have happened. And so if we go back to that first chapter, and go ahead and look back to the first chapter, if you would. If you go back to that first chapter, in that very first verse, I do find it in my book. Okay, if we go all the way back to that first chapter, each letter on the page, each Hebrew letter is a channel of energy, because for the first time in centuries, man begins to understand that everything is composed of energy. You know, it was Albert Einstein who came up with this, with the amazing algorithm, I guess I would want to use. E equals mc squared. Energy equals C for time squared. So everything is composed of energy. Understanding that everything is composed of energy, science has gone through the process of learning all kinds of things about that have changed completely our understandings. Sometime I'll go back to Bereshit and Genesis 1 and talk about the things that Dr. Gerald Schroeder, 3 doctorates, one in plant biology and one in astrophysics and a third one in composition, gives us amazing understandings of what Einstein taught and what has been compilated since then in the whole process. Well, anyway, the story begins as we look through this, and you go through the first line, and there are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. Now, if you're looking at the 22nd letter of the Hebrew alphabet, you're looking at a vav. So our vav, which is a man, is standing there in the midst of our text. What does he see on both sides of him? He sees heaven and earth. That's Adam. That's us. But let's go back to the beginning again, and let's go back to the third word. The third word is Elohim. Now, when you're looking at the word Elohim here, and as you begin to understand that it's located there, one of the things that you begin to see is the fact that it goes into an understanding, because it's only God. Now, if you go from those 22 letters there and you look for the next Elohim, which is the next line, you begin to see that there is a difference of, what is it, 5 words, and we're back to where we're at. Well, I should get back to where I was at. The understanding is that God is the focus of the first chapter. God is the focus of Miketz. God is the creator of all things. And among those things he's created is a halom. He creates a dream for Pharaoh that he might understand and save the world, but not without making profit on it, but he will save the world. Okay, so let's do the words halom. The first letter is a het. Now, a het resembles a gateway. In fact, that's what Arizal calls it. It's a gateway into something. What is it a gateway into? Well, again, when they were beginning to look at the alphabet, as the alphabet was being formed, one of the things that was understood was that a het is a vav and a zayin. A zayin is the next letter. It looks like an axe. And there's a bridge between the axe and the vav. And so this bridge makes this a gateway. And so what kind of gateway is it? Well, it's a gateway into something deeper. Now, the vav is feminine, or is masculine. The zayin is feminine. When a Jewish man and woman go into a huppah, they're passing through a het, a gateway into marriage. That's the understanding. So it's a marriage between two. It's a binding together. That's what's going on in this particular case. Now, het has a value of 8. The vav has a value of 6. The zayin has a value of 7. 6, 7, 8. 6 is the 6 days of work. Zayin is the 7th day of Shabbat. The 8th day is the beginning of a new thing. What's going on? It's a transition. So we transition from work to a Sabbath to something beyond, something new. So in our dreams, we are creating new things. Not really, because the dreams are often composed of the things that we've done during the day. Science tells us that when we do sleep, one of the things that has to happen is we have all these inputs from the world during the course of the day. And so our brain that has picked up all of these bits of information has to figure out how to place them somewhere. And so it begins the process of putting them into something. And so we put them into a neural network in our brain. For example, if I were to ask you, what color is the paper that I'm holding up? Well, you'd say white. And I said, well, what do cows drink? Well, you'd say milk. Oh, you know it's not milk, you know it's water. Well, why would you say milk if you know it's water? Because of the fact that I've already caused you to go to a different neuron net to look for an answer. So your first answer was, what color is it? It's white. So paper is stored here. Now the idea of drink and food are stored in other places. When you and I were reading the first sentence of this text, our brain was firing in 14 different sections all at the same time in order to get it to be able to read it. That's how complex reading is. Now imagine storing that information. Where do you store it? How do you store it? And so it's stored in all portions of the body. That's one of the things that I learned. It's called the molecules of emotion. Some of the newest scientific understanding is the brain is wonderful, but it's not capable of storing everything. In fact, we know it doesn't store everything. Have you ever walked into a home and smelled something special and it brought you to a memory of something not in that home, but in the past? Well, where was that memory stored? Well, it's actually part of your nose system. If your wife or husband would come up and rub your shoulders, and all of a sudden it takes you someplace, what's happening? Well, your brain can actually be your skin. We store our stories all over our body. They're not just in the brain. So we have this constant changing of what's going on and what we learn. And so that's all a part of the new understandings. So in this particular case, then, Het follows the culmination of a week. In other words, it's the evening activity in which we sort and start over again. That's what's going on. Now, dreams are a gateway to really something that's, well, and sometimes it's a divine message or an insight. I know there's many times when I want to wake up just to write notes down on a piece of paper of things that I all of a sudden became clear to me at night. We call it wisdom or insight. The only problem is if we don't put them down immediately, that insight's lost, that it's not there. We still have some understanding, but we lost that connector that was there to it. Now, Het is closely related to the word Hayut. Hayut. Hayut means life force. And in this case, sleep deprivation, to deprive somebody of their sleep over a period of time, which was a common practice when you're trying to interrogate somebody, is you drain them of their sleep. And Hayut is the life force that leaves the body. That's the same idea when we go to dreaming. Our body begins to give up some of its answers. 8 is the number for infinity. As we look at it, the next letter in it is Lamed. Lamed's the letter, it's the tallest of the letters, if you remember. And the Lamed means to learn or to teach. So as you pass through this gateway, one of the things that's happening is you're bringing yourself to a position of learning or teaching. Now, in order to study Torah, I was always taught the first things you need, 1 is a Torah, 2 is a teacher, and 3 is a student. And so you begin the process one-on-one. As the process goes on, the teacher may go away and the student becomes a teacher to somebody new. Now, the problem with us is the fact that we don't all have the rabbinic knowledge that the Jewish people do. So therefore, we still need them. We still have to understand. I have books, hundreds of books, all aimed at trying to help me understand what little I can from what they already know. And so I'm working on it very slowly. But it helps me to understand the world in which we live. Now, this letter Lev also is the first letter of a very significant word, and the word is Lev, Lamed Bet. Dreams are actually experienced in our heart. Remember, when the dream was done, immediately the Pharaoh woke up. In other words, it frightened him into awakeness, or it caused him. Have you ever had one of those dreams where you feel like you're falling off a skyscraper and then all of a sudden, just before you would hit the ground, you wake up? That emotion of heart, everything that's in it, it's an emotion. And so the concept here is the idea of emotion. And so as we look at this, the Rabbi Avraham Abluthia said that Lamed Bet is 2. Bet plus 2 Lameds, teacher and student, create a heart. So the standard of learning is through the heart to heart. 30 is also the standard number of days in a month. And based on the months in which we go through, we have a birth cycle. No moon, full moon, no moon again. The idea of going through an entire cycle: birth, fullness, death, birth, fullness, death. That's a cycle that we all go through as we go through this process. The Vav is the 3rd letter, which you already talked about. It looks like a man. It's a pillar, somebody upright, standing on the earth, reaching towards the heavens. We see it in Jacob's ladder. as it goes up from where he was at. Vav also means and, as it by itself. So when it says Vav et in our story, well, et isn't a word. Et is the Aleph and the Tav. So this is the joining together of the heavens and the Aleph and Tav that join together with the earth. So in other words, all of it is constructed together from the letters. In Genesis 1:1, it's the 26th letter, and it stands next to the Aleph Tav. The Vav is inverted, or can invert a tense of a story. This is back to the grammar. A Vav can change a story from past tense to future tense, or from future tense back to past tense. The Vav really connects time. That's what it amounts to. That's what Einstein was talking about in his equation. So the ability to transform time can be found in the Vav. The Vav is significant because we need to transform time. We need to teshuvah. We need to repent. That's the idea of taking away that which we had and replacing it with that which is good. The last letter is Mem. Mem is the idea of water. In fact, if you look at the word water, it's Mem, Yud, Mem. The first Mem is open. In other words, the water is being given to it. The second Mem is closed, like a well or a cup that holds it. And in between is the Yud, the drops that are going from the open to the closed. Water is in Hebrew. One of the books I have is called Swimming in the Sea of Talmud. It's swimming in the water, the immersion in the words, immersion in the stories, going as deeply into the stories as you can over and over again, because the more you do it, the lower you can actually go. This is my 14th time through the Torah portions. That's why I call it walking through Torah, is the idea that what I know now is much more than what I knew the first time I went through. And what I know next year will be more than what I know this year. That's the way it works. Mem is also the number 40, and 40 speaks of a transition from something. In other words, when the transition of Noah went from a dry land when he entered into the ark to the 40 days of rain. Then the 40 days of the earth was opened up and it began to put. There's a transition there. When Israel left Egypt, they took a 40-year transition to get to Jordan, to Israel. They went by a longer route, but the idea was that there's a transition in this whole process. Moses went up on Sinai for 40 days, where he learned Torah from God, brought down the tablets. Now remember, the tablets he came down with are not the ones that we now have. Those were broken before we could see what was on them. We have only the remnants of that. According to them, the first set of tablets was the idea of Sefer Beriah, the idea of the throne room. We have what's called Sefer Yetzirah, the idea of that which is just below, the formation of the worlds. So we continue to go through all of this. Now, all of these ideas come together to help us understand what a dream is. A dream may have no particular meaning to us at all. It's just a bunch of unread letters. But a dream can also be more than that. It can be a way of positively strengthening our understanding and our will, how we conduct ourselves. How prophetic a message is depends on our relationship with God. God is the one who determines what some of these dreams are going to look like and how we're going to react. So a prophetic meaning is destined to come from these dreams that Joseph is now talking with Pharaoh. But it's more than that. And that's what we're going to hopefully see as we go through this, that the dreams themselves are going to become very significant. Now, remember, he had in the book of Genesis, in fact, another trivia. This is the month of Kislev. It's the month of Hanukkah. It's also called the dark month. it's the cold month. It's the beginning of the winter season. And so it's when in the olden days, and maybe even today, when the lights go out early because it's dark longer than it is light, that we oftentimes find ourselves going to bed. And the idea is that the longer you're in bed, the more dreams you can possibly have. Kislev is a month of dreams. We saw 4 of them in our story so far, but there were other dreams that are found in the Torah. In fact, before Genesis is done, you should have read 10 different stories of dreams, including the dream of Jacob and the ladder that goes up to heaven. So Joseph has now heard the dreams. And so the Pharaoh then said to Joseph, this is verse 17, in my dream, behold, I was standing upon the bank of the river. Notice now how he frames his dream. When he first said he saw the dream, he was above the river. Now he's beside the river, along the river. In other words, his position has changed, which tells us something is going on within Pharaoh. And behold, out of the river there emerged 7 cows and 7 robust flesh and blood forms, and they were grazing in the marshland. And suddenly 7 other cows emerged after them, scrawny and very inferior forms and emaciated flesh. I have never seen inferiority like theirs in all the land of Egypt. And the emaciated and inferior cows ate up the first 7 healthy cows. They came inside them, but it was not apparent that they had come inside them for the appearance remained still inferior. So they went into the healthy cows, but the healthy cows no longer appeared, only the scrawny cows. He learns the same thing into verse 22. And I saw in my dream, behold, 7 ears of grain were sprouting, withered, thin, scorched by the east wind, were growing after them. Then the thin ears of grain swallowed up the 7 good ears. I said this to the necromancers, but no one could explain it to me. So Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dream of Pharaoh is a single dream, not 2 dreams, but 1. And it's been repeated for you. Here we go. So the 7 cows are the 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. It is a single dream. Now the 7 emaciated and bad cows who emerged after them, they are 7 years and are the 7 emaciated ears scorched in the east wind. They shall be 7 years of famine. So we learned that the good ears and the good cattle are ideas that go along with 7 years of plenty. The 7 years that follow those 7 years are 7 years of famine at that point in time. We're going to find out in the story, or you'll find out in the story, that by the time Joseph's brothers begin to come down looking for grain and those things, 2 years of the famine have already happened. And so 5 years were yet. Now it says, behold, 7 years are coming, the great abundance throughout all the land of Egypt, and the 7 years of famine will arise after them, and all the abundance of the land will be forgotten. The famine will ravage the land. Times it is because the matter stands ready before God, and God is hastening to accomplish it. So he gave him these 2 dreams because he wanted to encourage Pharaoh to find the answer to his dreams, because he was about to begin the process of the famine. Now he doesn't begin it that night. There's a period of time yet to go. But I want you to also understand there's something else going on in here, because it says in verse 32, as for the repetition of the dreams 2 times, it's because the matter stands ready before God, and God is hastening it to accomplish. Now, let Pharaoh seek out a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed, and let him appoint overseers on the land. And he shall prepare the land of Egypt during the 7 years of great abundance, and let them gather all the food of those approaching good years, and let them amass grain under Pharaoh's authority for food in the cities and safeguard it. And the food will be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine, which will befall the land of Egypt, so that the land will not perish in the famine. Now they're going to gather all of this grain. Now, my first thoughts usually aren't right, but anyway, my first thoughts was that there would be a giant building at Memphis where the Pharaoh lived, and that this building would be what's going on. But the understanding is that grain stored has to be stored in a place of likeness. In other words, if you were a Nebraska wheat, you'd be stored in Nebraska, or corn, you'd be stored there. If you were also found to have corn growing in Indiana, this corn would be stored there because of the fact of this likeness. In other words, the elements themselves determine the length of survival of that grain. Yes, the grain, it's dry there and it should last longer. But the concept is that all over Egypt that time, Joseph was building great buildings in order to store the harvest. That way the men didn't, when they were harvesting the grain, didn't go far before they put the grain away. So the grain was being stored in various locations across the country. But in order to tap into those granaries, one would have to go to see Joseph, who would be the dispenser of that. Because you see, Pharaoh began to understand, you need to find somebody who's smart enough to manage this and negotiate all of this and get prepared for this to happen. And so that there was a time of preparation before this whole famine business started, or the good years started. Now, then verse 39, then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has informed you of all this, there can be no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and by your command, you shall all my people be sustained. Only by the throne shall I outrank you. So Joseph becomes the second in command. He doesn't overtake Pharaoh, but he's the second in command. And that becomes very significant because he now controls everything that Pharaoh has. Pharaoh puts all of his trust into him, just like Potiphar put all his trust into him. Now, as the story goes on, Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have placed in your charge all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh removed his ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand. He then had him dress in garments of fine linen, and he placed him a gold chain upon his neck. He also had him ride in the second royal chariot, and he proclaimed before him Evrek. And if you notice the word for Evrek in Hebrew is the idea of counselor, I think is the word that I'm looking for. That's as close as I can get, I think. It's really a composite word of father. And so anyway, counselor, father counselor. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without you, no man may lift up his hand or foot in all of Egypt. Pharaoh called Joseph by a new name. Now, Joseph has this new name, but whenever we'll read about him in the text, he will always be referred to as Joseph. The name was a name given to him just for the purposes of understanding, because he did Zenapheth Paneah, or the idea of what is it? What he knows what is hidden, I guess is an easy way to put it. And so he becomes the interpreter of dreams, or he knows what is hidden. And so he begins to go through this. Now he learned much of his understandings from Jacob, who learned it from Joseph, or from Isaac, and Isaac from Abraham. And Abraham gave us the information that we're now using. So this is about all I want to cover tonight, but I wanted to give you an understanding of this chapter and where it's going. Now, as you remember, I said there's 146 verses here. 146, well, is 2 times 73. 73 is significant in Gematria because 73 is the number for Chokmah, knowledge. So it's, or wisdom. So it's 2 times wisdom. The wisdom that they're talking about, there's 2 kinds of wisdom that are understood biblically. The first kind is called higher wisdom. That's Torah wisdom, based upon the 70 understandings of Scripture. The second kind of wisdom was the wisdom that Solomon had, and that's called lower wisdom. And it's lower, but at the same point in time, one can delve into it to learn some of the secrets, the sod of the text. And so that's what that's about. Now, the gematria for Miketz, I said, was, well, the word Miketz itself has a value of 230. Well, 230 is 23 times 10. 23 is the value of a word called Hayah. Hayah is the word used to describe the 4th part of our soul. You see, there's 5 parts to the human soul. There's the nephesh, or that lower part, what we might call an animal soul, the ruach, which is the spirit that's there, and then the neshama, which is the 3rd part, the part that we strived for. The 4th part is that living part, that's the hayah. The 5th part is called yechidah, which is the highest form. When one reaches yechidah, one is in one-to-one relationship with God. You've reached the pinnacle. So 23 is equal to the 4th level of our soul. And the idea of 10, well, this is the 10th parsha. 10 is also the number of the Sephiroth. So it's the completion. The ultimate person is one who can understand, interpret, and imply or apply the 10 parts to the soul, to the Sephiroth. It's also 23 is a prime number. Not only is it a prime number, but it's the 10th prime number. Did God just pull a number out of the hat and all of a sudden things just kind of lined up? Or is there so much intricate understandings in his text that we basically have not even begun to understand him? Well, one more step down. Look at verse 41, chapter 41, verse 1. If you're looking at that, that's the first verse we started with. If you're looking at that, you're going to see that it has 10 words. Remember I said that the original scholars oftentimes were mathematicians. They saw the math before they saw the language. Well, they took the first verse, which goes all the way to the colon in a regular book, and they found that there are 10 words in that first verse. Then they went and counted the number of letters that are in that verse. Lo and behold, they found it had 37. 37? Yeah, the value of the word yechidah, the oneness. The idea of becoming one with the text, understanding it so intimately, so deeply. That's what was going on. So God is already trying to bring us into a deeper relationship with him and a deeper understanding of what's in his word. Hopefully, as we go through these weeks together, you're going to come across some understandings that you've never seen before. And it's going to cause you to go deeper into the text. Maybe someday you will go as goofy as I am about all of the little things that are in there. Not that I don't keep track of the 7 laws, because I do, but I use them to get me into the text further. That's why Rav Avner is such a great rabbi to listen to on Thursday mornings and on Monday nights. He has a great deal of wisdom to give to us. So anyway, shalom, have a good night, have a good week.